everyone. Today, I thought instead of doing what I'd promised of both the texts of terror and also the book of Ruth, there was enough content in Ruth that I thought we could spend this week focused on that. And we can certainly come back to the questions that we talked about last week in terms of whether scripture is prescribing how things ought to be, or whether it is simply describing how life actually is and how we experience it. But when it comes to the book of Ruth, I'm curious to hear from the crowd, what comes to mind when you think about the book of Ruth? What kind of associations do you have with it in your past thinking about it or studying it or learning about it?
I think about deep connection, deep love, loyalty, a very special relationship between two women,
Yeah.
an unusual relationship.
An unusual. Yeah, why is it unusual?
Because of the cultures that they come from are different. They are not doing things the way necessarily things are done, and that Ruth doesn't want to leave her mother-in-law, Naomi.
Now you're open.
Yeah, thank you, Carol.
For me, I found the book quite by accident. And it's a very small book when I was studying. And I also used a piece of that scripture in my wedding.
Which piece did you use?
I don't remember exactly.
Yeah,
but my husband says, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord.
Yeah. Is it this one where you go, I will go, where you lodge, I will lodge? Something in that.
Well, it's the devotion that you have for one another.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. So some things I wanted to plant in our minds as we go through this is keeping in mind, where does God turn up in this story? So kind of looking for God's presence along the way. And also thinking about voices, because each main player in this story has a very specific voice with a message that they deliver. And those voices tell us about each character's beliefs. And so we can notice the voice of Naomi as it contrasts with that of Ruth. And we can think about, what does Naomi seem to believe about life and about God and about their role as women? And by contrast, what does Ruth seem to believe, shown by how she acts? And finally, what about Boaz? Because he plays a major role in this story, as you know. So in thinking about Ruth, the setting here is the time after the rule of judges, and a severe famine has been plaguing Israel. And this is several generations before King David. Now, it's interesting that there's a famine in Bethlehem, because Bethlehem literally means bread basket or house of bread. And so here we are in this period after the judges, when the people did as they chose. They did not follow God's law. And so here people are experiencing the consequences of that. But I'm curious, this idea of a famine feels pretty foreign to me. I'm a privileged person. I don't experience starvation and famine the way that these people do. And so, but as I think about famine, I know that many of us have family histories with our ancestors who experienced famine. If any of you have had ancestors who immigrated to the US to find opportunity, to find food, I know that my ancestors from Sweden left in the late 1800s because there was a series of famines all throughout the 19th century. And finally, it became so severe that they had no choice but to leave their family and their countries behind, and in some cases, never being reunited with their family. And certainly the history of Ireland is very similar, and many other countries as well, including today. And so I don't want us to miss the importance of the famine in this story and the history of famine that these people have been experiencing. And so then the characters we have are the family of Elimelech. So we have Elimelech, who's the patriarch, along with his wife Naomi and their two sons. And because of the famine, they flee Bethlehem and they seek a better life in the country of Moab, which is modern day Jordan, to find food and better opportunity. And Moab is a problematic country because earlier on in the book of Genesis, we have all these other associations with Moab, that the people of Moab are descended from this incestuous union of Lot and his daughters. Moab is associated with perversity as a result, and with hostility. And the people of Moab do not serve and worship the God of Israel. They have their own gods, and they use their food for idolatry and a sacrifice to local gods. And in fact, in Deuteronomy, we learn that Moabites are excluded from the assembly of God. And while Elimelech's family is in Moab, Elimelech himself dies, and he leaves behind his wife, Naomi, and their two sons. And the two sons then marry Moabite women, Ruth and Orpah. And sadly, after about 10 years, both of the sons, Mahlon and Chilion, have also died, which leaves all three men of the family died, and they've left three widows. And as we know about widows in this time of ancient Israel, that meant poverty, that meant loss of any kind of social status. There was no safety network for a widow. You were a burden at that point on anyone who may have taken pity on you, but your life was pretty dismal at that point. And so as we think about Naomi and her loss, here she has lost her husband. She's lost both her sons. And she's got these two daughters-in-law, Ruth and Orpah. And the cultural convention of the time was that both Ruth and Orpah were bound to Naomi at this point. And so it was common for them to stick together. It was not common for them to go back home to the house of their father. It was assumed that they would stay together in this culture. And Naomi tries to say goodbye to her daughters-in-law. She tries to say, go back to your mother's house, and the Lord grant that you find security with a house and a husband. And this is Naomi breaking the rules. She's essentially saying, like, don't throw your lot in with mine. Like, my life has ended as we know it. You go back, try to find some kind of economic security for yourselves, save yourselves, essentially. And Naomi is simply stating the facts of life for women in that era. When you're without a husband and family of your own, you'll continue to live very meagerly and perhaps starve. And so Naomi tries to say goodbye, and there's lots of weeping and lots of grieving. You know, these women have grieved together over the years, and they are a family unit. But the daughters-in-law declare that they will stay with Naomi. And again, she says, no, go back to Moab. But in the end, it's Orpah who takes her leave and says, okay, Naomi says I'm free to go, so I'm going to do that. But it's Ruth who clings to Naomi. And again, Ruth is a Moabite, so she always carries this connotation of seduction and idolatry. She will always be a foreigner in the land of Bethlehem, which is the land that Naomi is from and where they are returning to. And Ruth, in her famous declaration of faith, says, "Do not press me to leave you or to turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do thus and so to me, and more as well, if even death parts me from you." So here's that faithfulness that Carol was talking about. It's her declaration of loyalty to Naomi and to Naomi's God. Here she is saying, I'm leaving behind the idols of my people of Moab, and I'm saying yes to a life with this God that you worship. And with that, Ruth forever leaves the chance to go home to Moab and to her mother's and father's house for the risk of being with her mother-in-law. And so I want to ask, do these choices make sense to us?
They do to me.
Yeah, say more about that.
When you talk about loyalty and following in the ways of my husband, I'm very much a New Yorker. I kept my maiden name. It's a New York historical name. And my family members live in the homes that my grandparent, or one of the homes that my grandparents lived, and the home that my father first bought in the 1950s. So it's very much, and I graduated from the same high school as my parents. So the hometown is very much the hometown for me. And I was New York educated. It's like somebody being a Californian and being educated in California.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So who do you think you would have emulated? Do you think you would have made Ruth's choice or Orpah's choice?
Ruth's choice.
Yeah. It's incredible.
I was not brought up as a Lutheran either.
Oh, okay.
So I followed the Lutheran roots of my husband's family, who has many clergy persons in it.
Yeah. That's wonderful. I also was not brought up Lutheran. I was brought up very different as a Presbyterian, but I'm very happy to have found my roots now in the Lutheran tradition.
I will say, Annalisa, you did, however, go out into the world and say, you know what, I'm going to return back to my mother's house and back to my homeland. I'll probably find some guy who I can settle with there.
Yeah, he'll do all right. That's right. I was an Orpah. And yeah, and another bit of family history. My grandmother was one of 4 daughters, and 2 of them were named Ruth and Orpha, which we think was the Swedish variant of Orpah.
Swedish, yes.
So yeah. Okay, so Naomi and Ruth. After Ruth's declaration of love and loyalty, Naomi, the text says nothing more to her. So we don't know if this is Naomi kind of rolling her eyes and saying, all right, Ruth, or if she just was overcome with emotion. Again, Naomi has been flattened with grief. She defines herself as too old, as empty, and as unfulfilled. And Naomi laments that her name is no longer Naomi, which means sweetness, but rather Mara, which means bitter. Where she says the Lord has brought her back empty and has dealt with her harshly. And in fact, when the women arrive in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred by their arrival. This is a small town. It's a farming community. Everyone knows when a newcomer has come in. And the women of the town ask themselves, is this Naomi? For they hardly recognize her after a period of just 10 years. She is so changed. And People have different reactions to Naomi's lament when she says, "The Lord has brought calamity to me and has dealt harshly with me." And it's the Lord that has done this. I'm curious what your initial reaction is to Naomi's lament.
Is that not some of what Pastor Ben was talking about in terms of loss, in terms of love for one another? I'm thinking my father had a stroke the weekend that we were all gathering for a family reunion from different parts of the United States. He ended up being a handicapped man, having to retire from his job. And he ultimately died after 4 strokes. And my mother was the caregiver. That's love and devotion, really.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, despite the harshness of their new reality, she continues to love and be devoted.
I think about Naomi as being like some of the stronger people in the Bible that argue with God and say, "God, why did you do this? Stop doing this. Let my people go. Let me have just a couple more people here." When they were talking about Lot, in the city, I just feel like she had an incredible faith and strength and said, "Hey, I believe in you. I've devoted my life to you, and this is how you pay me back. Thanks a lot."
Kind of calling God to the table reminds me of Job as well. Yeah. People have just in the reading that I did this week, there are some variations in how people perceive Naomi. Some people perceive her as being negative, and that here she is just lamenting and but other people say no, she's like the suffering servant of Job. She hasn't completely abandoned God. She said, "God, why have you abandoned me?"
You all are much more generous of spirit than I am towards Naomi. I see Naomi, and she literally tells people, "Don't call me sweet," which is my name. I'm going to change my name to bitter because life's bitter. And I'm like, really, Naomi? Yes, she's gone through a lot, but also the idea that the Lord has brought her back empty. The Lord has brought her back with Ruth. What a gift of fullness in your life. But it is true. She does still talk to God, and yes, the Bible has many good examples of people saying, "God, what gives?" And that is a healthy way to respond as well.
Sorry, Ben, I don't agree with you.
Bring it, Cheryl.
But then when you say it that
give Naomi a break. Not only did she lose her husband, when women usually live a little bit longer than men, and so they depend on their sons, especially back in those days, to take care of them. So not only did she lose her husband, she also lost both of her sons. And she's just left with this other woman who's also lost her husband. So it's like, give me a break, God. What are you trying to do? What am I supposed to be learning here? This is really making me mad, pissing me off, making me bitter.
Yeah.
Not that
pretty hopeless.
Yeah, not that we should stay there, but that's the natural reaction that one would have. I would have if I were in that particular culture, and not only did my husband die, but both of the people that were supposed to be taking care of me have also died. So what do I do now? Just sit in a lump and die myself, or what?
Yeah, we can understand her stages of grief. And
And,
oh, go ahead.
and you know, this is Sharon. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good.
Yeah.
So also, we all face many trials and tribulations in our life, even us women today, caregivers. Some days it becomes so overwhelming that you do say to God, okay, what's going on here? We've gone through this. Why do we have one more thing to go through? Can you please give us all a break? And
Yes.
when you're the woman, you take on so much more in that caregiving aspect of your husband's life or any other person that you're taking care of. So I don't see her, I understand her bitterness.
Yes.
I have been there many times.
Yeah.
So I agree with you there.
It's okay. Yeah. Thank you, Sharon.
I have been somebody that has benefited from caregiving.
Yeah.
Well,
And
I benefited from caregiving too, but some days it is beyond your, I mean, we're only human.
Yeah. Yeah. And those are the days when we say, you know, not by my power, but yours, get me through.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's normal to have feelings. Yeah. And our feelings change. And yeah, is Ruth is a presence of love and support for Naomi, even if Naomi is in the throes of suffering and grieving.
Thank you all for helping me see the truth and the honesty in Naomi's lament. Yeah.
And don't you think too that when you're grieving or bitter, you try to find someone who may have already been there or is going through it maybe in a different way so that you have that common ground?
Absolutely. Yeah, there's nothing like having someone who has that understanding.
If I were Naomi, I also might be thinking, well, okay, Ruth, you can hang out with me. This is good, but you better not start complaining.
Pipe down. Know your role. And just to kind of highlight this in case we haven't covered it, or in case you haven't covered it in your readings of Ruth, again, she is a foreigner associated with a very strong stigma. She's a widow, and after years of marriage, she remained childless. In the Bible, she's referred to as barren. And as we know, women carried and continue to carry emotional weight and pain and incredible suffering for not being able to have children and provide children to your family. And in this case, it's life or death, socioeconomic security. So we'll keep that in mind as well. So enter Mr. Boaz. The text tells us that Ruth and Naomi arrive back in Bethlehem in time for the barley harvest. So Ruth and Naomi are settling in, and they have no source of income or way to provide for themselves. And so Ruth sets out to find some work to bring in food for the family. And she decides on her own initiative that she will glean behind someone in whose sight I may find favor. And this was interesting. I didn't realize that gleaning was actually part of Israel's legal welfare system. It was in the
Yes, it
law
was.
that if you were harvesting your fields, you left the corners of your fields untouched, and you would do a single pass through a field in the harvest. And anything left in the corners or anything that you didn't pick up in the first round would be left for gleaners to come through.
Mhm.
But even with this this welfare system in place, it would not have been very much food. So you could still expect a very meager proportion even after a full day's gleaning. And you could be mistreated by the paid harvesters and the workers of the field, especially as a woman. You were very vulnerable. You could be ejected from the field without any reason. So you were really vulnerable in those situations. And it was a competitive situation too, because there were other gleaners there who were also fighting for those scraps of food. And the text tells us also that Naomi has a wealthy relative on her husband's side named Boaz. And what field did Ruth happen to glean in that day but that of Boaz?
Got married with him.
That's right. And Boaz, we know, is a landowner. He's well off, he's powerful. He's also highly respected in the community. The text calls him a man of valor. And Boaz blesses his workers. The first kind of mention of him kind of coming onto the scene, he says, "The Lord be with you," to his workers. And then they bless him in return. And Boaz notices Ruth, this newcomer in town, and he asks about her. And his foreman tells him, "Oh, this is Ruth, the Moabitess. She's Naomi's daughter-in-law." And Boaz kind of puts this together because there's been some village gossip about these women, and he's heard of her already and of her loyalty to Naomi. And we learn that Ruth has made an unusual request of Boaz and his site foreman.
Yes.
She asked to glean and gather directly behind the harvesters. So not the place of the gleaner kind of coming behind after they're finished, but gathering directly behind them so that she could have a better chance at getting more food. And this is going against all custom. This is going where gleaners are not permitted and outside the parameters of what was in the law. So she's being pretty brash and bold here, this foreign Moabitess. But despite that, the foreman says, "Well, okay, I'll check with my boss, but all right." And Boaz gives his blessing, and he shows compassion and hospitality to Ruth. He says, "Okay, stay with the young women in my fields. Don't go to another field because you might be harassed or harmed if you do that. I've told my men not to harass you, and drink from the water vessels that my young men have drawn so that you don't have to go far outside the fields looking for water." And this ensures protection for Ruth. And he also provides for her. He gives her more than the other gleaners are getting. And so Boaz then blesses Ruth, and he says, "May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." So Boaz recognizes Ruth's faithfulness, not only to Naomi, but to God. And here, remember, she came from Moab, so she chose to follow after God. So Boaz is commending her for this. And I'm curious, where in the part of this story do we see not only the letter of the law, so the letter of the law, but also the spirit of the law?
Women are allowed to glean.
Mhm.
They're permitted to glean. They're provided water.
Mhm.
So there's the spirit of the law. The gleaning does happen, so it's permitted to continue to happen.
And I would even say that, that they're permitted to glean because that was within the law. But that amount was really small. That was a very meager amount. What Ruth was asking for and what Boaz delivered was far abundantly beyond what the law prescribed. And so in that sense, Boaz is acting within the spirit of the law of understanding like this law is in place because there are people who need food and there's enough to share. And so we're going to share it. And Ruth, to her credit, takes initiative and she asks for this. Otherwise, she may not have received it. Yeah. I like this brassy foreigner. And so Boaz further instructs his men to let her glean from the sheaves that have not yet been harvested and to even pull out some of the harvested grain to give her. So helping her further by giving her more grain. And we learn that by the end of the day, Ruth takes home an ephah, which is about 2/3 of a bushel. And that estimate is about 30 to 40 pounds of grain at the end of the day. And to put that in perspective, the average daily wage of a harvester was 1 to 2 pounds of grain. So she was given abundantly more than what she normally would have expected and what other workers would have taken home. So later that night, Ruth returns home with her bounty of grain and food. Here's Naomi, who is likely, close to starvation herself. And Naomi says, "Blessed be the man who took notice of you." She wants to know, where were you today? There's no way that you could have gotten this on your own. There must be a man who's taking care of you. And they discover the family connection that Boaz is one of Naomi's nearest kin. And Naomi she blesses Boaz. She says, "The Lord bless him. He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead." So here we have Naomi as much different attitude from earlier, where she's saying the Lord has left me and has left me empty. She's saying the Lord has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead. And this kind of kindness is hesed, which is loyal, steadfast, unfailing love. And my question is, where else have we seen this kind of love in the story? This loyal, steadfast, unfailing love.
Ruth's loyalty to Naomi.
Yes.
Mhm.
And so we learned that Ruth continues to glean in Boaz's field until the end of the barley and wheat harvest, which is about 6 to 7 weeks of time. And finally, one day, Naomi is thinking, I need to seek some security for you, Ruth, so that it may be well with you. She's thinking about their economic situation and their future. Now, here is our kinsman Boaz, who is winnowing tonight at the communal threshing floor. Put on your best dress and go down to the threshing floor, but don't reveal yourself to him until he has eaten and been drinking, presumably alcohol. When he lies down, notice where he goes, and then go and uncover his feet and lie down beside him. He will tell you what to do. And Ruth agrees. So Ruth puts on her best dress, gets gussied up, and goes down to the communal threshing floor. And the threshing floor was a communal space where the men of the city would winnow the wheat and the grain by separating the grain from the chaff, by either beating the stalks on the floor or using a sieve or a scythe. And no reputable woman would go down to this place because it was known, threshing floors were known for drunkenness and immorality. So if you were a woman of good repute, you would not be seen in this men's den. And Ruth does as Naomi has instructed her. She waited until Boaz was well fed and had drunk. She kind of hid out in the shadows. And she waited until he was asleep. And then she uncovered him and lay down next to him. Now, scholars kind of disagree on what the phrase uncover his feet mean. Some translations say it's a euphemism for uncovering his genitals. And others argue that it was just his feet or his legs that would have let the cold night air awaken him. But either way, Boaz would have been exposed in some form. And Naomi's plan is telling Ruth to make it look like a seduction has taken place, and poor Boaz was just too drunk to remember. This puts Boaz in a compromising situation where he is forced to marry Ruth to save her honor and his honor. So again, this is the reality of the world that they were operating in and that Naomi knew very well. Naomi knows if Ruth is going to be taken care of, we need to get her a husband in order to survive by hook or by crook. And so,
Not a very nice friend.
and so Ruth has uncovered Boaz and she's laid down next to him. And then in the middle of the night, around midnight, Boaz awakes and he's startled to find a woman next to him. Didn't remember this when he laid down. But then Ruth deviates from the script that Naomi has given her. Instead of saying, instead of just waiting to see what Boaz would do and waiting for him to tell her what to do, Ruth identifies herself and she says, "Spread your cloak over me, your servant, for you are my next of kin, or you are a close relative." Essentially, she is saying, take care of me and marry me because I am your next of kin. She was very bold in what she was asking. And when she says this, "Spread your cloak over me, for you are a close relative," she's invoking two laws. One is that of the levirate marriage, and the other is that of the kinsman redeemer. And to be honest, Ruth is kind of confusing the two. She's sort of combining them in a confusing way, but we're going to work with it anyway. So the levirate marriage addressed cases in which a man died without an heir, and the man's brother was required to marry his brother's widow and try to conceive a child with her. This union would provide for the widow, and then any sons born from this union would then take the name of the dead father. And the uncle the father in this case would then take on the financial responsibilities as well. Then there's the kinsman redeemer, in which when a man fell into financial trouble and was forced to sell his land, his nearest relative was called to rescue and purchase the land to keep it within the family or within the tribe. And this involved great sacrifice. You had to come up with the financial capital to make this purchase, which takes away from your son's inheritance. Now, Boaz is not exactly, he's not the brother of Naomi's dead husband. So he's not technically bound by this idea of a levirate marriage. But even so, Ruth is saying, look, I am your close relative, take care of me. And the kinsman redeemer is a little closer. She's not wrong with that. But what do we think of Naomi's plan at this point? And what do we think of Ruth's proposition?
Perfect for Valentine's Day.
Perfect for Valentine's. This is how all good romances start.
I think a little devious
Little
on
devious.
their part. Yeah. Scheming, but trying to survive.
Trying to survive. I had that exact same reaction. I really struggled with this. I admit that I wanted the story to be different, because the way that it is difficult. But here we have a broken world and a broken system in which these widows are kicked to the curb and left without any help and any way to really provide for themselves meaningfully. Without the generosity of Boaz, they would still be eating very meagerly. And Ruth was pretty bold and brash, but she was also straightforward in what she was asking. Even though her plan of sneaking in under the cover of night and lying down next to Boaz, that part does seem devious and scheming, but in the end, she deviates from Naomi's plan by just saying, look, this is who I am. Please take care of me. And Boaz blesses Ruth again. He says, I will do for you all that you ask, for everyone knows you are a worthy woman. And again, we hear this word chayil, which is the same word that we hear used to describe Boaz, someone of high valor and honor. And also it's the word used to describe the wife in Proverbs 31. So Boaz, again, praises Ruth for her loyalty, both to Naomi in this matter. And he also praises her and blesses her for not going after the young men, rich or poor, which is interesting. So this is an instance of how scripture both documents and dismantles oppression. So Ruth is a barren, impoverished foreigner and a widow. All strikes against her to make her undesirable as a wife. But instead, she asks for Boaz to honor this idea of a kinsman redeemer and to help her. And Boaz agrees. We also learn in this transaction or in this interaction that Boaz is not the true next of kin. He says, there is another who is nearer to the next of kin than I. And if he will act as your next of kin, good. If not, then as the Lord lives, I will act as next of kin for you. Go ahead and rest until the morning. And so Ruth awakens before the others and is prepared to sneak out so that no one will see her. And this gives her and Boaz a chance to save face without tarnishing his reputation. But before Ruth leaves, Boaz sends her with a full cloak full of barley, or 6 measures full of barley. So once again, Boaz is providing and taking care of Ruth and indicating he intends to fulfill his promise for her, and his promise to her.
Can I jump in for just a second? I want to say how big a deal it is for Ruth to sneak out in that moment. Right? The whole plan is built around the idea of trapping Boaz, trapping him because all the guys in the town are there at the threshing floor. And they wake up and they're like, oh, Boaz is in bed with this woman. I guess he's got to marry her. But by sneaking out, Ruth gives Boaz a chance to go back on his word and not marry her. And so that's significant towards her character, not just as a woman, but also as a Moabite, right? As a reminder, the people of Moab get their start when two women, Lot's daughters, get their father drunk and rape him. And so this, like, for Naomi to suggest that Ruth do this, it's just saying, oh, you're a Moabite. This is what Moabites do. They get men drunk and they sleep with them. And Ruth's like, oh, fine, I'll live into your stereotype. But when she actually gets there and has the interaction with Boaz, she says, no, right? That's not what I'm going to do. I'm not going to force this guy into a relationship with me. I'm instead just going to ask him. And when he says yes, I'm going to honor him by not shaming him into marrying me. I'm going to give him a chance to do it honorably.
Yes.
Do you think Boaz was smitten with her from the very beginning?
Yeah.
Yeah, I
That's
mean,
a good question.
yeah. He certainly respects her from the very beginning.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, we know that he commends her for her loyalty to Naomi.
That's the most important thing.
Yeah. It's nice to think about in a kind of a romantic situation that he was smitten with her. But the text doesn't tell us. Yeah. And so
Well, I think she was a very brave woman
yes.
in those days. You know, that survival will make you do many things, but I think she was very brave.
Yeah, she's shown that time and again in stepping forward, in leaving behind her homeland to go with Naomi, and asking for what her family needs to provide. Very brave.
There might have been some chemistry too, because you were talking about how he noticed her in this community. She's new, asked about her relationship with Naomi. So I don't know. This Valentine's Day, folks.
Yeah, they were smitten.
And they were certainly of the same kind of character. Both of them were known as worthy within the community.
Yes.
When Boaz hears of her, he says, "Oh, well, everybody knows you're a worthy woman. That's the reputation that she has been creating for herself in this community." So Ruth comes back home in the early morning hours, and Naomi asks, "Who are you?" Or are you someone's wife yet? Did our plan work? She was looking out for Ruth's security and her own, stating, "So that it may be well with you," but also thinking about Ruth's future, knowing that Naomi's days are less than Ruth's at this point. Naomi is older. And Naomi was also aware that Ruth is even more alone in a foreign land without her and without Naomi's connections to Bethlehem. One scholar points out, and it's not super important, but it's unlikely that Boaz was unmarried and without sons at this point. He, in achieving this level of honor in his community, he likely would have had to produce a family of sons. And so Boaz is being put in this position where he already has a family that he's taking care of, and now he's being asked to take on another family. This idea of a eligible bachelor who just hasn't gotten around to marriage yet because he's so focused on his career did not really exist in ancient Israel. So it's something that I found interesting. And further, shows Boaz's desire to provide in this situation. A very foreign world than the one that we live in, but it was the world that they were living in.
Annalisa,
Yeah.
I find that question peculiar, who are you? It's like, did your identity change overnight?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, what do you think about that?
Well, are you single or married or attached?
Yeah.
Committed?
What's your status?
What's your status?
Yeah, did we succeed in getting you married off, even with scheming? Absolutely. And we often use the New Revised Standard Version in our services, but I'll just find the text here. Another translation is, how did things go with you, my daughter? Yeah. But yeah, that question of who are you now is a very profound one. So Boaz, a man of his word, goes to the city gate and just so happens to run into this next of kin in question, this man who is a closer relative to Naomi and to Ruth, and is sort of one removed from Boaz and in the line of succession of being this kinsman redeemer. And Boaz invites him to sit down at the city gate, and he also gathers 10 men of the elders of the city to act as witnesses to this conversation. And Boaz reviewed his business, that Naomi is selling the land that belonged to her husband, Elimelech. Now, land was extremely rare in Israel. It's a small country. There's not a lot to go around. So the opportunity to acquire more land is a highly valuable investment. Boaz says, I thought you should know. He probably already did know. I mean, people know who they're related to, and they know the business of other people. But anyway, Boaz is saying, I thought you should know so that you could have the first chance to buy it. Let me know, for I come after you in the line of eligible buyers. And the man says, well, yes, that sounds good to me. I will redeem it and I will buy that land. And Boaz says, oh, but you know about Ruth, right? You are also acquiring Ruth the Moabite, because she's the widow of the heir of this land who is dead, and you will honor the dead man's name and his inheritance. So the man would take Ruth as his wife, and any children they had would be his responsibility, but they would bear the name of Ruth's dead husband. And at this, the man said, I can't do that without damaging my own inheritance. Go ahead and take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it. So he's claiming that it would be too much of a financial investment for him, that he's not prepared to take on this widow and any children that she might produce. And Boaz says, okay, all of you are witnesses here today to this business transaction of marriage. And the text tells us, before that, the elders who are present say, may the Lord bless Ruth with many children, as Rachel and Leah built up the house of Israel. And we learn that Ruth conceives and bears a son. Remember, she was childless before, so it was a miracle that she was able to conceive. And the son was named Obed. And the women of the village say to Naomi, blessed be the Lord who has not left you this day without next of kin. May his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. So here they're affirming that the Lord has restored and nourished Naomi at long last. And the women say, for your daughter-in-law, Ruth, who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has borne him. And then Naomi took the child and laid him in her bosom and became his nurse. The women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, a son has been born to Naomi. They named him Obed. He became the father of Jesse and the father of David. Now this is interesting that Ruth at this point no longer has any voice or any presence in the story. It's she does the work of conceiving and bearing a son, and then it becomes essentially known as Naomi's child. But in doing this, it also erases the stigma of being a Moabite. And it, in effect, weaves a Gentile or a foreigner into this family and genealogy of Jesus. And so Ruth, the Moabite, became the many greats grandmother of Jesus, showing us that God is God not only of the Jews, but also the God of the Gentiles. And so I'll come back to this question of where did we see God present in this story? It's challenging without the text in front of you, but also God doesn't really appear explicitly. We hear God being blessed. We hear people referring to the Lord, but there's no direct mention of God's presence or God's voice in this story. But as one great theologian who I live with pointed out to me, Ruth is actually the embodiment of God's steadfast love for us, even when all hope seems lost. So here, when Naomi is despairing and lamenting in her grief and in her suffering, Ruth is there with her to comfort her and to say, no, you can try to send me away, but I'm not leaving you. I am clinging to you. And so Ruth becomes this beautiful embodiment of God's steadfast love. And Ruth also doesn't back down when she encounters stigma and discrimination for being a poor woman who's a foreigner with all this stigma attached. She boldly asks for what she needs. And I love that we have her as an example of, even when we live in a very broken world and we're operating in a very broken system, and we ourselves are broken people, we can, with God's grace, still experience love and mercy, and God continues to provide for us in ways that we may not have expected.
I think that one of the really important things is not only was she loyal to Naomi, but she was also, your God will become my God. And I think that there is a part of that makes her be strong, and God willing to, or not willing, but merciful enough to say, yes, you've taken me as your God, and I will protect you, and I will give you somebody to inherit the land, so that you and Naomi can live okay.
Thank you, Cheryl. Yeah. Were there any surprises for people this time around? Anything that kind of struck them in a new way, or something that maybe you've thought about in the past but were reminded of?
That a Moabite would be part of the Jesus line, King of David.
Yeah, I had no idea the significance of that. Mm-hmm.
And it's worth pointing out, right? The gospel goes out of its way to mention that Ruth is one of Jesus's ancestors. There's, I think, 3 women named in that genealogy, and Ruth is one of them.
Yeah. Yeah. Any other reflections, or does anyone else burning to say anything that we maybe skipped or didn't get to?
I thought Naomi was pretty scheming, actually. She was bitter. She was blaming God. And then she said, get over to that field of that wealthy relative and then go sleep with him. You know, just, yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
she's scheming, if you ask me.
Yeah.
And then she gets the kid.
Then she gets, yeah, that's right. She gets all the honor and the kid.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sounds like a story out of a royal lineage, or yeah, Catherine the Great or something. Yeah, I struggled with that too. I think I wanted to see a character who was flawless and didn't have any faults, and who always did the right thing. And I think Boaz is sort of portrayed as that person who always does the right thing. But as I reflect on it, you know, when people are put in these desperate situations, yeah, that's where scheming happens. And it, you know, God worked good from it, but it certainly could have gone in a very different direction.
One
Well,
of the
Annalisa, yeah, I'm kind of curious, why is Naomi a popular name? It particularly seems to be in the Hispanic world. It seems to be like Ruth, like my beloved spouse, is much more worthy of being memorialized in people's names. What is so great about Naomi? We've just heard all the bad side. What can we say in her defense?
Well, we know that the name means sweetness or pleasant, so that could be something.
Well, yeah, kind of like sugar, huh?
Sugar, I guess so. Sweet.
Yeah, that
honey.
doesn't quite make it with me.
I think resourceful.
Yeah.
I think Naomi was resourceful.
Yeah. One of the things I like about the whole book in terms of women is that frequently when you're reading through the Bible, the people that get the best, that a woman could either be Eve, who's considered evil, or Mary, who's a virgin and who's the all-time saint, right? So you can either be a saint or a sinner, but only a saint or only a sinner. And in Ruth and Naomi, you see the true humanness of both of them.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Annalisa, can you hear me?
Yes.
I have a thought for you. We haven't talked about the fellow who was taking care of Ruth, what his mother was like. I have a sense that his mother was able to instill in him the ability to look out for people. And I think that when he was looking over his harvesting field and he saw Ruth out there, I think that he was already attuned to looking out for people, for caring for people. Nothing's ever said about his mother. And I think that she had a powerful influence on him. And I think that's, by the same token, I think when Ruth was I'm going to say in bed with him, that she also had a respect for him because he was looking out for her and for his generosity. You know, I mean, she was a go-getter. By the same token, she had respect for his integrity of taking care of her and her mother-in-law. And let me tell you, taking care of his mother-in-law, that I always found that very unique, that he took the ability to do that and to stay with her. That's one of my most favorite stories in the Bible, is the story of Ruth and Naomi. So that's my 2 cents worth.
Thank you, Carl. Thank you. And that's a beautiful reminder of, yeah, the people who are not explicitly mentioned, but who have had a lasting impact on these characters and on their development and on the person they become. Yeah, thank you.
Why didn't Ruth go straight to Moab to begin with? She was going back to her homeland. She knew that he was her relative. So why didn't she could just knock on his door? Or should I say Naomi?
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. That's one thought that I came across was that, yeah, the men in this village are not living up to their honor and their role as men. You know, we have these customs of the kinsman redeemer that clearly people knew about, but no one was acting on. And so, you know, you have to wonder, why were the men just sitting around doing nothing? Yeah, it's a great question. Is that kind of what you were asking?
It's to follow up on that. It's worth remembering that one of the other women named in Jesus's genealogy is Tamar, who's in a very similar situation where her husband dies, but his brother refuses to impregnate her, refuses to marry her and impregnate her. And so she literally has to trick her father-in-law into sleeping with her so she can be married and he can fulfill the role of the levirate marriage. To say, from the earliest parts of scripture, it's very clear men try to get out of this as much as possible. And so it could well be that Naomi sort of assumed the men wouldn't live up to it unless they could be tricked into it, the way Tamar tricked her father-in-law.
Yeah, and this community is still recovering from the effects of the famine that has been going on. So people are probably even less willing to extend themselves in a financial risk or investment that might ruin them or could harm them. Yeah, looking out for their own interests. Well, thank you everyone for joining us on this this interesting text. I know I learned a great deal from this, and I'm grateful for all of you and your participation and your thoughts as always. And next week we will be looking at women in leadership, and specifically Ephesians 5. When we ask whether the husband is really the head of the wife. So stay tuned for that. A little post-Valentine's discussion. Yeah. Well, have a blessed week. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Annalisa.
Bye-bye.